feel good vibes, and great music. This is Radio 44. Your music, your life.
Even the other stations are listening.
Well, a very, very good morning to you. Hope you're having a good one right here. Well, I did tell you we do love to have the talk that everyone sort of shies away from, but the talks that we definitely shouldn't let go of. So in the studio with me, I do have Seema Dhanak. She is a leading expert when it comes to domestic abuse and domestic violence. This is a conversation we all need to have, so ensure that you keep it locked on to Radio 44. If you have any queries, of course, get in touch with us. 0758 123 444. Don't go anywhere. And in the studio right now, I do have someone very special who's come down all the way from the UK, Seema Dhanak, who's an expert on domestic abuse. It's an absolute pleasure to have you right here with us at Radio 44. Welcome, Seema.
Thank you, and good morning.
Good morning to you. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Jeet?
I'm doing phenomenal. I think our conversations off air have literally, put me in a different space right now. I think this is an absolutely important thing that we are talking about, and it being silent on such an important matter, it's as equal as being part of it.
Absolutely. And that's why we're here, to spread the awareness on the subject of domestic abuse and really think about what we can do as communities and as individuals to really start to change the way that we respond to domestic abuse. And that's why I'm here.
Absolutely. All right. So let's start off with you. So what motivated you to, become involved in this activism against domestic abuse? Is there a personal story that drove you into this? I want to hear that from you.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to share a victim or survivor story, but actually I can't. I have a very sort of happy marriage, and although I grew up in an environment where I heard lots of stories in my childhood about someone or another suffering with domestic violence, and in all fairness, that many years ago, the term domestic violence wasn't used. It was always, someone's daughter, someone's sister suffering at the hands of their husband, and listening to sort of my mum and my dad and other members of the community talk about it with a real sense of sadness, but also a feeling of helplessness. And I think, I remember that sadness never really left me growing into an adult. And then, my career, if I have to be honest, is what threw me into this. I don't think I ever chose to be someone who does this in terms of domestic abuse awareness. I sort of started off working with local government homeless teams, and that's when I first came across domestic abuse in a professional arena. And I had a phenomenal Mauritian woman who said these words to me, that Seema, you do not have to be a victim of domestic violence to do this work. You need to just be able to help them in a diligent and safeguarding kind of way. And why should we wait for victims of abuse to stand up for themselves when we have the ability to do that? And I think that's what sparked the fire in me to really try and look at safeguarding and domestic abuse in the professional era. Okay. And that's how it all started. And then since then, it's kind of just grown, and I've kind of worked with communities to really try and create more awareness. And I also realised that actually, in the UK, we're a very multifaceted, very multicultural country. And, domestic abuse, although universally some things are the same across all across all communities, there are cultural nuances that vary what happens in each type of community, and we cannot ignore those things.
Speaking on that, when we hear domestic abuse, domestic violence, we only think about the physical form of that.
Yeah.
So what are the forms of domestic abuse? Or, is it just violence, or is it verbal abuse? What other forms are there?
Right, so it's categorized as physical violence, verbal abuse, control and coercive behavior, manipulation in terms of finances, so you've got financial and economic abuse. Okay. And of course there's the real biggest taboo within domestic abuse is sexual abuse. And one wonders that how can sexual abuse be possible in a relationship such as a marriage or a consented boyfriend-girlfriend type relationship. But actually, marital rape is actually a real big thing, even in our Asian communities. And actually, that's the biggest taboo. That's the biggest part of domestic abuse that no one talks about. But it's also the most important one too.
Good Lord. Okay. All right. We'll be joining you shortly. Right now, dropping you this one by Rishi Rich and Jay Sean and Juggy D. In the studio, we do have Seema Dhanak with us, and we are talking about domestic abuse and domestic violence. Now, you did talk about the different kinds of domestic abuse. I think, in your opinion, I'd like to hear from you. What are some of the most effective strategies for preventing domestic abuse?
So what's worked in the UK is the awareness around the subject. It is really putting the message out there in terms of what is healthy and what's not healthy in relationships.
Okay.
And the second thing is obviously, when you're aware that, okay, someone is in a relationship that is abusive, is the support for the person who is the biggest victim. And I say the biggest victim because some relationships, the domestic abuse can be 50-50.
Yeah.
But the support for the person who is the most vulnerable is the most effective strategy. We can't ignore, as soon as they've told us something like, they're suffering with physical or emotional abuse, what they told us. So not invalidating them. Let's not kind of use their material as material for gossip culture. Let's actually hear them out, and let's really kind of support them in a way that makes them feel safe to be able to talk about the abuse. Because in the UK, statistics have shown that it takes up to about 36 disclosures of domestic abuse before a victim of abuse will decide, I've had enough and I want to leave. 36 disclosures. Which is why it's so important that we hear them out and we allow them to make those disclosures, because it will get to a point where they will hear what they're saying themselves, realize that this is not conducive for themselves or for their children or for their families, and they will leave. But it can take as many attempts as that before they actually leave. So the most effective strategy is validate them, make them feel safe, support them. And one of the things that we do in the UK is exit strategies. We work on what do you want as a goal, as a victim of abuse? What can we do to help you to get out of this? And sometimes they'll turn around and say, I actually don't want to leave this relationship. I'm still emotionally invested. I'm in love with my husband. And actually, I just want someone to hear me out, someone to know what I'm going through, so I don't feel like I'm going crazy.
Oh, God. That's dangerous, actually.
It is dangerous.
Very dangerous. All right, so you work closely with the UK government in, advocacy, lobbying. Now, what successful initiatives or campaigns have you been involved in to fight domestic abuse?
Okay, so I work on a sort of local government basis. So certainly within the local authority that I worked in, and I was there for about 7 years. The most important thing that I did was train up my own colleagues on responding to domestic abuse in an appropriate way, in a way that safeguards victims correctly, and that they're not putting the victim in harm's way even more. I then also went on to become the first responder for human trafficking and modern slavery. Okay. Which is also very closely intertwined with domestic abuse, because that's where sometimes often the grooming side of things comes into it. And women and young men even are often groomed to come to the UK with the hope of a relationship and a life in the UK, and then are actually put into domestic servitude or human trafficking. So I was the first responder for that. And my other achievement, I guess, is two things. Firstly, really lobbying for mindfulness around cultural nuances. The UK, like I said earlier, is a multifaceted, multicultural country, and it has to take into considerations things within our cultures that can put victims at harm's way, that an ordinary person in the UK who's not Indian or not Asian or Black African might not necessarily pick up on. For example, honour-based violence, FGM, female genital mutilation, and forced marriages. So really being able to lobby for that awareness was probably one of my biggest achievements. And my second one is the fact that now my expertise is being used to actually train local government staff, particularly in homeless teams, on how to respond to domestic abuse correctly.
Excellent. Keep it right here on Radio 44. We will be back after this. Now, another question that I would like to ask you is, what advice would you give to someone who suspects that a friend or a family member is going through this? We've seen this.
Yeah.
We've seen this all the time where, someone is going through something and the rest of us, we hear this and we don't know how to handle it. The only thing we do is talk amongst ourselves and say, oh, it's sad that this person is going through that. But what should someone do?
So I think we really need to start calling it out, and we have to be very, very careful with how we do this, because when it comes to supporting a victim of domestic abuse, what you don't want to do is create more danger for them. And I've often had friends and family saying, well, why can't we just go and teach them a lesson? And actually, that's not the way to do it, because actually, like behind closed doors, that will put the victim in more danger. So we have to be very, very careful about how we do that. So the way actually is to really, get some time alone with the victim of abuse and actually sort of start with the conversation of, are you okay? Is there something that you want to talk about? And actually allow them the opportunity to open up to you. And if they don't, then actually, be compassionate in your approach of saying, I'm aware that you're going through this, and I want you to know that I want to support you. I don't agree or condone what you are going through, and I'm here to support you. And is there anything I can do to try and help you with strategies on coping with the abuse within your home? Because to sit here and actually say, well, it's not my sister, it's not my brother, it's not my family member going through it, actually makes us as complicit as an abuser ourselves. So I think we can't ignore it, and we should call it out, but we have to be very, very careful that we don't put the victim in harm's way.
Okay, so ensure that you don't endanger. So the whole old school way of teaching the person a lesson,
that can actually make it worse.
Oh God!
Yeah.
All right, okay. Thank you for that. That teaches me something. Nevertheless, keep it right here on Radio 44. We will be back right after this.
Radio 44.
All right, now back on the topic of domestic abuse. Look, this has to be asked. I know, people may consider it taboo, sweep it under the rug. Men also go through domestic abuse.
Do you want to know the statistics?
Hit me with it.
So 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men.
Are you kidding me? Mm-hmm. Wow.
And that just goes to show that actually the problem is not just women suffering domestic abuse, men suffer too.
Yeah.
And, I was asked this question recently, that what capacity do women really have to do harm to men? And actually, huge. Whether it's physical violence, psychological, men suffer in a completely different way. It's a much bigger taboo for them. Men suffer with mental health because they have less of an outlet. There's a lot of solidarity and empowerment amongst women, and there's still need for more. But when it comes to, the solidarity amongst men, let me ask you the question, what would happen if you told your friends in a bar or in a club, I'm suffering domestic abuse? What would be the response?
Exactly. They would look at you in a very different way that you'd never want to talk about it again.
Exactly. They'd laugh at you, they'd ridicule you. And I see this even in the UK as well, that men have gone to professional services such as the police, housing services, saying that they're victims of domestic abuse, and they are just basically point blank refused services because the feeling is that men are independent enough to deal with their own. And then what does that do for a man's mental health? The suicide rates for men is 40% higher than it is for women, and that just goes to show that their mental health is significantly impacted, especially if they're in an abusive relationship.
Yeah, because you're right. I think we as men, I'm also guilty of this. When you go through something, rather than sharing what exactly you're going through, you'd rather just keep it inside and handle it yourself, because you feel like no one out there is going to understand it, and even if they do understand it, they're going to judge you for it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would also say is that as a society, men make up the other half of the population, right?
Yeah.
So men have a really, really important role to play, irrespective of whether they are victims of abuse or not. They have a really important role to play in preventing domestic abuse, because women can't do it on our own.
Yeah.
It's not solely a woman problem.
Agreed.
We've got men who are perpetrators, and we've got men who are victims, and vice versa. We have female victims and perpetrators too. So the only way that we're really going to create a society which is abuse-free, and I realise that's ambitious, but to at least prevent it, we need to work together as a team and not have this them and us kind of team,
Understood.
segregation.
It has to be a united front, basically.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, how can someone reach out to you for advice if they're going through something, or if they've heard, somebody else going through something? How can they reach out to you?
So I have an Instagram handle called V2S Empowerment, which stands for Victim to Survivor Empowerment on Instagram. So you can reach me through there. Alternatively, my email address is seemadanak@gmail.com. Please feel free to email me and I'll come back to you.
Seema, it's been an absolute pleasure, enlightening as well. I think this is definitely a game changer. People need to hear conversations like this.
Thank you.
They need to stand up for themselves. They need to be a little more vocal. They need to talk to a friend. Don't fight the fight alone.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good one.